Thank you, dear and respected friend. Thank you so much for your kind participation in a very historical day. As you know, today is 10th March and it is observed as Tibetan Uprising Day. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Gandhian School of Democracy and Socialism, welcome you to attend today's GSDS Weekly Forum. And the topic of today's session is going beyond betrayal and hospitality narratives, India's Tibetan conundrum. The topic suggested by our speaker of today's session. I welcome Professor Anand Kumar, eminent social scientist from India, and our GSDS Forum nurturer. I welcome the speaker of today's session, Professor Dibyesh Anand, head of the School of Social Sciences at University of Westminster. So we have two Anand, both engaged in a kind of Tibetan causes. And Professor Anand is also president of Bharat Tibet Sangh. I welcome Anand Giri, Brajesh Goswami, Shashi Shekharji, Professor Gyan Gului, Dr. Rachna, Anand Mukund, and all friends who present here. Let me give a brief introduction to our GSDS Forum. GSDS Forum stands for Gandhian School of Democracy and Socialism Forum, which is a platform to promote an understanding of the dynamics of society with quest for freedom, justice, equality, and fraternity. It focuses on knowledge and dialogue among concerned persons. We organize dialogue on every Friday and invite people from different fields of life to share their knowledge and praxis in order to make this world in a better democratic way. For all of us, for at least GSDS Forum, this is the first talk by Professor Dibyesh Anand, but he's well-known scholar. He's nurturing social science at London's Westminster University, and he has deep understanding of democratic movements, and he has a kind of authority on majority-minority relations in China and India. And he's author of a very famous book called Geopolitical Extrosia, Tibet in Western Imagination. He has written extensively in international journals and papers, and he has a kind of committed scholarship. He has engaged in also many social movement and protest, and for his kind of sadhana for Tibetan causes, he's a well recognized in Tibetan circle. And today we mark the day in 1959 when the communist Chinese government carried out a brutal armed suppression in Tibetan's capital Lhasa. And so for Indians also, it is a kind of history which always invoke our democratic consciousness. And Tibetan National Uprising Day holds a deep significance for not only Tibetan but also Indians, socialist youth who really cause for living in exile of Tibet. First, let's invite Professor Dibyesh Anand to share his thought around 30 to 35 minutes, as he has already told us that he has to go in a protest. So we invite Professor Dibyesh Anand to share his reflection on the topic. Yes.
Again, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you to the forum. Thanks for because it's such an important day. A very quick introduction to myself. The formal introduction was already done by you, so I'll not focus on that. And as Professor Anand asked me when we started, or before we started this event, is when did my interest in Tibet start? Now, frankly, I would like to say it was there forever. It's not. I'm originally from India. I grew up in India. I studied in India until 1997 for my bachelor's. I know many of you would not have been born then, so it's not irrelevant for you. But I finished my bachelor's in Delhi University St. Stephen's College in 1997. Until then, I had no clue about Tibet, right? So, and I was someone who was a very politically active person, going for protest on Palestine, going for protest on Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, Burma, right? I was doing all of that. So I was not someone who was a naive person who had no interest in politics, but I was very much part of politics. And yet, Tibet did not matter. We never heard of Tibet. In fact, first time my curiosity emerged on Tibet is after I left India in 1997 and came to England for my master's. And that is the year where 7 Years in Tibet came. And I remember the film 7 Years in Tibet and Kundun. But I remember reading news, and when Chinese president would visit UK, you'd always have large-scale protests, free Tibet protests. So my curiosity was, how come, what is this Tibet thing where people are protesting here, free Tibet? Then I realized, of course, more and more that, by the way, I knew about Tibetans. I didn't know about Tibet as a political cause. So there was almost an anger at myself and the Indian context that while Tibetan exile is mainly in India, most Indians are never educated about Tibetans. Right? See, so start with that. So my PhD was on Tibet, right? My PhD was on, so I started my work and looked at Western imagination of Tibet. So the book, Tibet, A Victim of Geopolitics. Don't try to buy it, just Google, you'll get it somewhere, I'm sure. I put it also on academy.edu. That's a very academic book, and I mean something specific by it. So while having sympathy for Tibetans, I was driven not by it. I was driven by the curiosity of, does positive representation of Tibetans in the West help Tibetans or not? So I looked at that. So I'll not go into that work later. It's only after my PhD, as I engaged more with Tibetan communities in India and exile, that I realized that it's not enough as a scholar to write about Tibet, but not care about Tibetans. Do you see the difference, right? So to write about Tibet, many scholars do that. They work on Tibet, they write things about Tibet, but you ask them to take a political position on Tibet and China, they'll keep quiet. They'll say, I'm a scholar. Now, for me, that's not acceptable. So that's how my journey. So I'm giving you a bit about my journey. So I started focusing more on the challenge that Tibetans face in China, and I use the word colonization. In fact, one of the recent not recent, a few years ago, I wrote an article. Check for that, because that's something that you like it or not like it, but you learn from it, is what I'm saying. Now, as activists, we know that China is colonizing Tibet, but most scholars do not use the C word, colonization. So what I argue there is that I've not taken for granted that you accept China as a colonizer. I'm explained why the only way to understand Chinese rule over Uyghurs and Tibetans, I look at both, is through colonization angle. Not neo-colonial, not post-colonial, not semi-colonial, but very much colonial. So I've called it colonization with Chinese characteristics. China vis-a-vis Uyghurs and Tibetans. So I've done that. So that's part of it. But as part of it, of course, I've engaged a lot with Tibetan community in Britain, Tibetan community in India, Dharamshala, everywhere. I've been many times, I have to say, to Delhi and Dharamshala to give lectures on keynote lectures, talks, seminars, panels on Tibet. What I have to say is, and I'm glad you're doing this as a forum, that in Indian context, I found it very disturbing that universities have very limited space to discuss Tibet. So you have to go to activist spaces or civil society spaces to talk of Tibet, not academic spaces. Now, like I remember a talk, and I have often been to JNU to give lectures in the past, not in recent times, by the way, right? But in the past, and I remember it's the JNU Tibet Forum that would invite me. Occasionally academics would, but academics' interest was more on China, not Tibet. And my interest was more on China, but via Tibet. And I hope you understand there's a difference, right? If you go to China and then see Tibet as part of it, or do you see Tibet and then you go to China, which implies you realize China is an occupying force. JNU Tibet Forum, there was one event which we did. It was important one, which I said, why should the left, Indian left, why should the left care about Tibet? Because what hurts me is how the Tibetan cause is sometimes appropriated by or spoken by the right wing in India, VHP kind of thing. Fine, I mean, that's what they do. I have no interest in them, but that's what they do. Why is left silent in Tibet was my question. Because if you take example of Tibet, Tibet is about human rights, Tibet is about challenging colonization. In both contexts, it's obvious that the left wing, which is meant to support human rights and freedom, should be supporting it. And yet, you'd hardly find, there are exceptions, you'd hardly find any openly left-wing person actually talking to Tibet. So that is what I was talking about. But I also spent some time at IDSA. IDSA, if you don't know, is Institute of Defense, Indian Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. That's a think tank. That's a government-related think tank, a very mainstream think tank. This is 2013. And my interest was to understand India's policies towards Tibet. Right? So see, I'm expert on international relations. I've looked at China and Tibet. I've looked at West and Tibet. I've looked at Indian academia and silences on Tibet. But what I wanted to understand was policy on Tibet, the government policy, etc. I have to say it was very difficult to research it because Indian political system and Indian bureaucratic system is very opaque, non-transparent. If I may say, I hope, and if you're ex-bureaucrats, you have to accept it. But it's a mix of ignorance and arrogance, where there's a lot of ignorance, but it's couched in arrogant terms. That it's often about, gentlemen, you don't need to tell us, we know it already. Then you say, okay, what do you actually know? And you question and you expose some of the bureaucratic thinking. The response is no, not that, oh, actually what you say is the right point, we should learn about it. The response is, who are you to tell us? So what I find, and this is a broader issue in India, what I found is there is almost a closing of ranks, right? Closing of ranks where the moment you are questioned at high level, bureaucracy, academia, government, everywhere, there's a closing of ranks and exclusion rather than willingness to listen. Now, why do I say it? Because what that leads to, of course, is a very distorted policy on Tibet. A policy on Tibet which most people don't know anything about. A policy on Tibet which is not actually a policy anymore because it's an approach. It's an approach which leaves Tibetan people very vulnerable. So it leads to a situation which is what my title says, betrayal or hospitality. So Tibetans often would thank India for hospitality. Dalai Lama talks of India, the guru, etc., right? And my approach as a scholar is, there's no reason, Tibetans should be grateful, but they should not really be grateful to India because India has done it for its own interest. Tibetans have served India's interest more than what India has done for them. I'm sorry, and it might be controversial for some of you if you're very strong Indian nationalists, but that's the reality. But let's say if we come to a moderate position, the moderate position would be that India has benefited as much from Tibetan presence as Tibetans have benefited from Indian hospitality, right? So it's not therefore about thanking one or the other. When have you, I'm not talking to you here, right? You're different. But when have you heard Indian politicians or Indian bureaucrats or Indian scholars in terms of think tanks ever thanking Tibetans for providing security, providing soft power? One thing, even today, if there's one person who acts as the biggest soft power resource for India, it's not the Prime Minister, by the way. It's not Gandhi in the name. It is the Dalai Lama. When Dalai Lama used to travel in the world, he'd always praise India. And that has led to so many people outside India thinking of India as whatever it thinks of India, right? Positive terms. So that's also soft power resource. That's what Tibetans have done. Tibetans have rejuvenated parts of India, Bodh Gaya, other places, Dharamshala. Tibetans have contributed to security in the frontiers, Special Frontier Force. Tibetans are fighting for India vis-a-vis China. And yet, in most contexts, you'd be fully aware that they're not even acknowledged. They're treated as, okay, yeah, they're helping us, but we don't treat them. Now, so what that leads to, of course, is that hospitality discourse of it, how grateful, India is grateful and Tibetans thank them. I think there's a limit to that. And as especially Indians, and I'm talking of us as Indians in that sense, not Tibetans, it is our responsibility to challenge the discourse and say, look, enough of Tibetans thanking us. Let's talk of what we can do together to protect Tibetans, help Tibetans, and also help Indians. Right? That's one. The second discourse, of course, is of betrayal. Sometimes when I've interacted with certain people who think that India betrayed Tibet. Right? In 1948, 49, 51, 59, India has betrayed Tibet. To an extent, India did betray Tibet, no doubt. But that betrayal Tibet discourse sometimes keeps that India didn't betray, Nehru betrayed Tibet. Right? And Nehru is responsible. And somehow I'm giving the example of VHP, Vishwa Hindu Parishad kind of discourse. It's very much that Nehru betrayed Tibet and we are here to help Tibetans. If you look at the reality of what the political front of BHP and others do, which is BJP, is that they're not very different, sadly. And I think sadly, right? And again, I have to be very frank. I have no interest in right-wing politics and I'm quite critical of them in my other work. But that's not the question here. The question is, what has BJP government or what has BJP done for Tibetan cause that has strengthened Tibetans vis-a-vis Chinese colonization? If you think they've done great, fine. I would like to know about it. But in my view, they have not been very different. So the betrayal narrative should not be only about Nehru betraying, because that's used against Nehru and against secular idea of India and not against the whole policy towards India, right? Therefore, we need to go beyond this betrayal part and the hospital part. And we need to acknowledge first the various contributions Tibetans make to India. I give you some examples: soft power, Bodh Gaya, pilgrimage, training Buddhist monks of Mongolia, Kalmyk Republic, and all of them are trained not by Indian monks. Remember, they're trained by Tibetan lamas based in India, most of them. So that's soft power resources. Security, because one Dalai Lama brings more security than most, maybe 100,000 troops. That's a reality, because he gives the idea that India is a better place than China because India is a democracy. So that's there. One needs to recognize the contribution. One needs to recognize, of course, the ways in which Tibet or Tibetan cause has benefited India, but not been, India has used it, but India has not done enough, is what I would argue, right? But finally, and well, I would like to make this point, because I would want some question and comment, then I can respond more clearly to you, that we have to start with the recognition of reality. China is a colonial power, full stop. Second, Tibetans are occupied, full stop. Third, India has given refuge to some. But does it mean that India will continue to give refuge? Or can India go Nepal way? In Nepal, what has happened is Tibetan refugees have largely been made completely disenfranchised in every sense. I remember giving this talk at IDSA, and I said, look, will India go Nepal way? The reaction was, that's not possible. India is a full-fledged democracy. We do not believe in that kind of thing. We will never sell out Tibetans. I wish I was as sanguine and confident about that as people at IDSA, because when you look at the ways in which the government and governments, not only this government, governments function, they have been successful in one way on Tibet. They have managed to make Tibet issue confined to few of us. And you'd know it, how few you are who are thinking of Tibet. Majority of people in India, majority of intellectuals in India, majority of policymakers in India do not know, do not care. And there's no knowledge production. I can even, England is a small country compared to India. There's more scholarship being produced on Tibet, broadly speaking, in 3 or 4 English universities than entire India. Scholarship in academia. And why do bring scholarship in India? And I'll tell you why. Because while activists, I see as myself scholar activist, but while scholars active, if we do not produce scholarship, it will end up on the shoulder of 4 or 5 of us to talk about it. And once we are silenced for whatever reasons, there's no one to talk about it. Therefore, while activism matters, and this is why I come back to you as a forum, and we also need to bring Tibet back into Indian universities, where people should talk about it different ways. Culture, yes. Religion, yes. And much of scholarship on Tibet is around culture or religion, largely Buddhism or history. Why not contemporary Tibet? That's not there. And this I'll go back to, and I end by saying, because then you'll have some questions hopefully. What I would want us to do is, especially when you talk about it, the best way to support Tibet and Tibetans in India is, of course, to raise voice, to give platform to Tibetans, to talk of it the way it should be talked about, but also work to change policy makers, but bring more awareness within universities and within civil society. On that note, I'll end my 20-minute talk, and then hopefully there'll be questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a very, very insightful session. And the way you invoked the idea of like our orientation towards Tibetan issue is really, really very, very important. And of course, there is a question of, international morality. We are, okay, we can talk about UN, can talk about rights of nation, but even our neighbors, the kind of suffering they have, even within our country, there are sufferings, but we are very silent. So, but the kind of invitation you are sharing with us is really, really remarkable. And it is very, very enriching. So I request our members to indicate me in the chat box, and please ask your question, and please be brief in question. So I can see one raised hand, Ananta bhai. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dibyesh. Now, your book, Tibet in Western Imagination, and your presentation, it raises the question of imagination, Western imagination, and my query is that how do we look at Tibet, the whole construction of Tibet and the problem of Eurocentrism and Orientalism, not only in the geopolitical way, but also in terms of knowledge practice and knowledge production. My second quick query is that in terms of contemporary Tibet, now what is the condition? Now the Dalai Lama is happy with the autonomy, but there are also Tibetan liberation movements. And my query is that what is your sense on the ground in Tibet? And while we are talking about Tibetan revolution, there are also questions about internal democracy in Tibet. There are some religious groups in Tibet which are banned by the contemporary religious regime. What is your thought on that? And finally, about India, what India can really do, and because India has always followed a very kind of defeatist approach to China, and what is your, the realistic way that India can do in this situation? And as you also brought the question of Palestine, my question is that today we need to look at the question of Tibet, Palestine, and Kashmir together, including the problem of the Uruguays in China, the whole question of self-determination and mutual determination. And what is your perspective on this in the contemporary world, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these questions. Just remind me, what was the first question? Because I noted down others, but I can't read my own handwriting of the first question. So.
In terms of Tibet in Western imagination, my query was what is the problem of Eurocentrism and Orientalism?
Okay.
And I think you are referring to not only the geopolitical construction, but also in terms of knowledge production and the epistemological limits, and what would be an alternative approach, for example, what is the question of Tibetan Indian imagination or Chinese imagination, if you have really engaged yourself with the multiplicity of imagination in the comparative historical context?
Thank you so much for this very important questions. I don't think I'll do justice by answering all of them, right? That's not even possible because this could be an entire talk and all the work, but I'll address some of it, right? But all of us should take these questions not as questions, but as food for thought for all of us. So one question is about Eurocentrism and Western way of thinking. So what I found in my work and what I continue to notice is that, let's say, the idea, China has sovereignty over Tibet, right? Most countries in the world recognize it. China has sovereignty over Tibet. So China is a state. Tibet is part of China. That's what logic would say. That's very much based on Eurocentric and European idea of sovereignty. Now, what I've argued in my different works is that the main beneficiary of Europeanization of Himalayan region was China. So Tibetans lost, China gained. So China became more Western. So today, I have to say, in today's world, China is more Western and European than Europe. Because at least in Europe, you have some idea that sovereignty can be pooled, you can come together as European Union, etc., and human rights should not be made secondary to statehood. In case of China, you know, ideology is very clear, supremacies of sovereign statehood, and then human rights, etc., is dictated by the state. So what is that? That's essentially a Westphalian European notion. So in that sense, sadly, we are all Europeans today in that context, right? That's one. Now, second, we think of Tibetan issue from other perspectives, Chinese perspective, yes. But if you look at the traditional Chinese perspectives, because there's no one Chinese perspective, you would recognize that, I mean, if you're not student of history, you are, but in others, if not student, you just remember that, of course, they were China-based empires that had Tibet as, that had a relation with Tibet. The Qing Empire, which is Manchus, and the Yuan Empire, which is basically the Mongols. But in those times, it was never a Han Chinese who was sent to Tibet as Amban, as a representative. What does it tell you? It tells you that it was not a relationship based on modern ideas of control, modern ideas of empire. It was based on traditional ideas of empire. So if we look at Chinese way of looking at it, there will be some room where Tibetans can be largely autonomous, if not completely free. But modern China is not Confucian. Modern China is modern state, which is European idea, right? So that's not possible. Indian imagination, again, if you look at it, I mean, frankly, if you look at even India today, India today has no connection to traditional Indian imagination. Because traditional Indian imagination could not be based on strict lines drawn on the map, where this is us and that's you. That was not possible. But we're talking of modern India, which is very much a European notion of India. Traditional Tibetan idea, reincarnation. Again, this is a work I've done. I can maybe share it with you via, I'll share it with you, whatever that, or just Google for my name and reincarnation. There's an article coming out also with Observer Research Foundation on reincarnation challenges. You don't know that Tibetan notion of statehood was based on fluidity. It was never a strict line on the map. And what I've argued in other works of mine, and I need to keep arguing that, is Tibet became a victim of Europeanization of this region, and then post-colonial states of India and China in particular, competing over those territories that belong to neither of them. Right? So that's what it was. Now, the situation within Tibet, I know we don't have that much time, and I'm sorry to all of you. I would have loved to be here, it's just that I have to go to Tibetan protest at Chinese embassy and then the gathering for March 10th. That's why I have to rush, not for something else. So Tibetan situation in India today is like any colony. Okay, one more thing. Traditionally, empires were won, like British Empire in India after 1859. It was strong, then it gives more power to local Indians, then a bit more power, then shares power, then a bit more power, and then independence. What is happening with China and Tibet is whatever limited autonomy and freedom Tibetans had is shrinking over time. So there's a complete absence of freedom. That's the reality. Of course, there are other religious groups, religious things that may not see Dalai Lama as their leader. And that has always been the case. But what we have to understand, what is happening in, I mean, sometimes the Chinese scholar would point out to me is, oh, how do you know what's happening in Tibet? Right? I said, well, you tell me, how do you know what's happening in Tibet? And why should your narrative, which is based on state, rather than my narrative, which is based on exile commentaries and based on my analysis as a scholar, why is your view better than mine? So, and I always go back to say, tell me, can you do research on Tibet? Can you ask genuine questions from Tibetans? Do they respect Dalai Lama or not? If not, then why is the research more important than mine? In fact, the onus lies on Chinese state and Chinese scholars to show that views like ours or mine are wrong. That's not there, right? Now, with Dalai Lama, you're right. There are differences amongst Tibetans, like any healthy freedom movement. There are those like Dalai Lama who want genuine autonomy within China. There are those who want independence around them. There would be some who are okay with China. They're part of the Chinese system. But the fact of the matter is, in international law, there's a right to self-determination, which is ultimately, it's the people who have to decide whether they want independence, autonomy, genuine autonomy, more autonomy, no autonomy to be part. So we as outsiders have no right to say. That's right to self-determination. And final point which Anand you made, and normally I'd never be careful with saying these things, but because I don't want the host to be in trouble. My views on self-determination are quite well known. I don't only talk in my work. I didn't talk of Kashmir. In my work, I've looked at Kashmir. I've looked at Kashmir, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Kurdish people, Palestine I mentioned, of course. We have looked at stateless nations, and you can see what I mean by stateless nations here. We look at all of it, because ultimately the only moral position that we can hold on to is that a good state is one that is as representative and democratic as possible, including allowing for right to self-determination. Now, you do know that even in Indian context that doesn't happen. But that's not my talk here, because of course, once I remember at a Tibetan event, I did say something on it, and my host my host got in trouble because someone from Indian government felt that, oh, why did they invite someone like me on their platform, right? So I know you didn't invite me to talk of that, but I'm just focusing Indian Tibet. But focusing on that, all I would say is more rights for people, more allowing. But even we come back to Tibetan issue, look, it's very simple. Until and unless there's a growing, and we said, what can India do? I know India's options are limited, no doubt. But within limited option, don't dishearten Tibetans. Don't make the life more difficult. Don't have confusing politics where you have an attack on Karmapa. If, again, for young people, you may not know, but for those of us not young, we know what happened with the way Karmapa and the whole scandal of it. How could Indian media, okay, how could, I know the answer, Arnab Goswami and his kinds, right? But how could a religious leader be discussed in public whether he's a spy or not? That's unethical, that's irresponsible journalism. And what it ended up doing was it ended up alienating Karmapa when there was no fact, absolutely. And I can say with confidence, by the way, because I have looked a lot into it, not written about it, the key reason why that scandal came out around Karmapa was not because Karmapa or his team did anything else. That's because there was a dispute over land between certain politicians in Himachal Pradesh who wanted to compete with Karmapa's estate to get that land. And because they could not, they created a scandal. And they got the land by them.
Sorry. Yes, I can see Professor Mira Chakrabarti has also raised. And then Professor Kedar Sharma ji. And I request a respected member to please brief in his or her comments.
Yeah, if you could be brief and I will be brief too, then I can cover some.
Yes. So we can collect many questions. Yes. Yeah. And I request Professor Anand also to please note down this question and you can answer.
Yeah, I'm looking at the. I don't. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Randhir and Professor Anand. Thank you very much. Dibyesh, what you have given is your point of view. That there is no one China, or there is no one India, or there is no one Tibet. So you have, when I remember, because my father was in army, I remember that even at a later age, when he was not actually supposed to be fit in the army, he was called when the Chinese attacked. So what I wanted to come to is that when Nehru accepted the Tibetan refugees, it is you can say that the value association that okay, I have to help my neighbor or this, that exists on the preconscious level of the episteme already. So the best thing is to help the person. But when you see that the academicians do not talk, is that there is this constant negotiation between the powerlessness and the power. And the China has always been, now of course, maybe because of the power alignment in different ways, it's not so fearful, but the Indian subcontinent has always been between hope and hopelessness, between power and powerlessness. And China has never been, I mean, though it's called socialist, I don't know in what way they are socialist, but their way of inferiorizing the issues, or those who, because for them, neither India existed, India and Tibet, we were just biological entities. And therefore, it went on with its attack or whatever you will say. But what isn't in this process this inferiority? Those who attempt such kind of marginalization, don't you think that? Thank you. Sorry, Randhir, did I take more time?
Thank you, Meera. I'll take it as a comment rather than question, frankly, right? You raised a very important point of hope, hopelessness, powerlessness. That is the situation. Now, if we bring it back to Tibet, you're right. I mean, Nehru, it's easy to criticize Nehru, but the fact of the matter is he had many things to handle. I'm also very critical of Nehru, but I'm also aware of that Nehru was product of his time. He has to balance between different things and different pressure. So what I would say, and when I said no India, no China, no one, of course, what I meant is that for there is one, but there's a lot of investment in what is the idea of India, which is healthy, not healthy. So for instance, Modi's idea of India might be very different from my idea of India, or your idea of India might be different from Gandhi's idea of India was very different from Ambedkar's idea. That's what I meant. So we need to have that plurality. Coming back to Tibet and Tibet, what I found amazing with Dalai Lama in particular is the hope part. Because mortal like me would just think, how can they have hope? How can he keep smiling? Given the situation they're facing, the colonization in the homeland, and precariousness and precarity in exile. Now, you may think that in the West, they have easier life. Not really, by the way. There's also challenge here. But in India also, we know it's not precarious because they're not even officially recognized as refugees. They have no rights as refugees in India, which is a very difficult situation. So only thing I'll add on academic part is, you're right. We have to constantly negotiate with power and powerlessness. Yet we have to take some responsibility as academics, at least, of where do we draw the line? And what I've found in academia, by the way, not only in India, but also in the West, is when it comes to power, specifically when it comes to China, not US, 90% of my colleagues will do a petition against US. When Trump comes, we all go and protest without any problem. When Xi Jinping comes, most of us will not care. On Israel, they will talk. On Palestine, they will talk. The moment it's Tibet, that's not our business because China is a good communist state, according to them. I'm talking left academia here, right? So I'll end by saying that with academics, we need that discussion amongst ourselves. So look, where do we draw the line? What cost will be there? Why don't we push back? Because if more of us push back against enforced silencing, direct or indirect, I think the situation will be better than what it is now.
Yes, Professor Dr. Kedarnath Sharma ji. As he's taking some time, there are some students who directly put the question on post.
Well, I'm looking at this Zoom meeting chat. I can't see any questions, so that's why.
They directly they text on me on. There is one question.
I can't read any question.
There is he's saying we love. He's saying that there are countries like Lithuania, Latvia. They are small, but they became independent. In what manner? In what ways? Tibet can also free from unfreedom.
Okay, yeah. So see, again, if you look at no state is a norm, right? I mean, not everyone is like Russia in every sense, or India or China, the big states, because most states are small states, right? So the fact of the matter is, and this is where there's a problem with the European notion of sovereignty, as I said, but there's also some liberation via it. So when you took an example, Latvia, Lithuania, it's based on essential self-determination. Latvians did not want to be part of Soviet Union, so they declared independence. They got it, and of course, they managed to get it because Soviet Union was crumbling at that point in time. So by law, international law, even by ethics, it makes sense if Tibetans, with their own homeland in Tibet, if they want independence or something else, they should have the right to decide. The problem, of course, we face is who will support them? Because when you have a big power and a small entity, most other big powers, sometimes they may support small entity, but in most cases, they'll keep out. China is too powerful for most states to take on. Now, West and China, as we know, is having challenges. India and China have challenges, but just note on Tibet, how India itself is mostly silent and complicit. And the reason for that are two: Kashmir, one. But second reason is also, I would say, even an epistemic, a principle-based reason, that India's position also has been like China's position, which is once you get independence from European states, there is no question of decolonization. Therefore, for them, decolonization is only about from white people and European countries into non-white states. So China is a beneficiary of it, where we have a situation where, by all logic, homeland, history, people, nationalism, Tibet ought to be independence. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that Tibet has the right to self-determination. Yet, you will not find many, well, no state and many countries supporting it. But what I would also say is, remember, not remember, who am I saying remember, but 50 years ago, I don't think anyone foresaw collapse of Soviet Union in this manner, right? Maybe in 1900, no one saw British empires collapsing in India. The reason I say this is because empires do not last forever. And if we go back to China and colonization in Tibet, I don't think, yeah, it's very powerful, but who knows what happened in 100 years' time. In 1980s, for those of you young, I will tell you, that in 1980s, there was all prediction that the next great power is going to be not China, Japan. Japan was the great power for them. Now no one talks of Japan as great power. So in international relations, geopolitics, things evolve, situation changes, in history, things changes. So the way I would say is, who knows what happens in 50, 60, 100 years' time, but it is important that as we, as forums, we as students, scholars, activists, whoever we are, I mean, we might be anyone, we continue to help Tibetans survive. Because even if China collapses in 100 years, if PRC collapses in 100 years, if Tibetans are not surviving, then which Tibet are we talking of, right? So the survival is where our role comes in. Okay, any other question? Because I have...
Yes. Just we have 10 minutes. So now we request Professor Anand Kumar, who is actively engaged in Tibetan causes in India and mobilizing civil society and students for Tibetan causes. So I request him to please share his reflection and as a chair remark also.
Okay.
Thank you, Randhir, and many thanks to Professor Dibyesh, Anand, for being so pointed and so clear in his analysis and his presentation. On my part, I belong to academic tradition of India, where Jawaharlal Nehru University was a place where Dalai Lama was most welcome several times, and Tibetans were invited for sharing their understanding. But as he rightly said, much of Indian academic system is overwhelmed by the presence of the Chinese interest and the value of Chinese invitation. They pump a lot of money and they invite, or the drop of a hat, anybody and everybody to China, which is not possible for Dalai Lama to engage even in Dharamsala. But there are new initiatives. I don't think that the Vishwa Hindu Parishad initiative is very old. We were able to cultivate their interests a few years ago, and they created a body called Himalaya Parivar. And they all of a sudden woke up to the reality of tragedy of Tibet. And now they are taking more and more interest. But they also don't have capacity to open the doors of either Foreign Office or Prime Minister's Office to make a memorandum available to the policymakers of today. On the other hand, it seems that there are new approaches where there is more objectivity. And we have 4 books in my mind for our reference and also for Dibyesh. One is a book by Manoj Joshi. This Manoj Joshi book is about Himalayan tragedy, and he talks about the problem of truth and hiding the truth unsuccessfully by both Indian establishment and the Chinese establishment, and where the Tibetan tragedy stands out like a most significant question. Then there is a book by Dr. Subramanian Swamy, who is member of the ruling party, but he says that not Nehru, but it was Sri Atal Bihari Bajpai who signed on the dotted lines to declare that India believes that Tibet is an integral part of PRC. It was not done before by any prime minister. And this was a sad regression on the Indian part. There's a book by the present foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, where he talks about many challenges before India, and he gives some insider view of what is the thinking of the present establishment going is there. Because to be fair to Shri Narendra Modi, he did invite the Tibetan government in exile representative at his first oath-taking ceremony. But then after that, he became more and more infatuated in hugging the Chinese leadership 18 times. But the result is a great tragedy in Galwan Valley in Ladakh and now in Arunachal. So there is a book by Dr. Jaishankar, by Manoj Joshi, and by Subramaniam Swamy. And of course, there is a continuous flow of literature by the Tibetan leadership in exile, including even today's statement by the Tibetans in exile, which keeps on informing us again and again. I must also tell Professor Anand that not us, but Tibetans have expanded their network, and there is much more material. 20 years ago, there was hardly anything available in Hindi, but now they have a regular television system, they have a regular periodical, they have a lot of literature in many languages, including English and Hindi. And that makes information flow easier. The biggest problem is the lack of courage of conviction. China is today a mumbo jumbo of 5 countries. It includes Taiwan, it includes Tibet, it includes Mongolia, it includes Uyghur, which is already in Chinese language called the new province. They themselves say that the Muslim part of East Turkestan was never there till 1949. And then, of course, there is Hong Kong question. So these are the fault lines which may erupt on a suitable occasion, as it happened in the Soviet Union case. Secondly, there is also a new consolidation around Indian Ocean. Earlier, Tibet question was related with Himalayan security, but India's security is becoming much bigger than Himalayan security because Indian Ocean is also being encircled by the Chinese diplomacy. And there is a togetherness of Japan, Australia, America, and India acquired. And then there are other countries like Sri Lanka and Indonesia who are victims of over-engagement with China. So there are new fault lines which need to be understood by the Indian supporters of the Tibetan community. There is also continuity. There is a great transition within the Tibetan community, and we as volunteers for the Tibetan cause are very impressed and satisfied with the smooth transition from Dalai Lama to Pempa Seri. There is a great continuity of the campaign, though there is change about the pattern of decision making, and it is not anymore dependent exclusively on the charisma of Dalai Lama. On the other hand, every day, Dalai Lama is increasing the circle of supporters by meeting people personally and also, of course, arranging engagement of the Tibetans in exile and global community all over the world. So, situation is changing. I have been in the movement for the last 30 years as an academician, and I must say that today it is a better informed India, but it is not critical enough. It is not significant enough. Though there is change of the regime and we expected that the present regime will be much more clearer, much more consistent. But till the Chinese point us really on our face in Galwan Valley, we were scared of negotiating the Tibetan question. And even now we at the top don't talk about China. But I think that the way things are happening, China has taken more than it can handle. And it's not only left, which is silent. Even the Muslim community of the world, our nation of Islamic nations, is not talking about Uyghurs, who are Muslims and who are not being allowed to practice. So there is something boiling at the back burner. Chinese can hide it, but the world is witnessing, and the support is growing on a daily basis. Within India, out of 750 districts, there are around 100 districts where there are active nucleus groups of Tibet friends, but there is no interest at the political level. None of the political parties, there are too many political parties in India, but not a single party has included Tibetan question in its manifesto, though there is a unanimous resolution of Indian Parliament of 1962. But that unanimous resolution is not remembered by either Congress or BJP or socialists of yesteryears. The last discussion in Indian Parliament on Tibet was in 1967. 1967. Indian Parliament is totally, in a calculated manner, silent about the Tibetan tragedy. But you can't wish it away, it's there. So far as the Tibetan reality is concerned, friends who are visiting Tibet in a very organized way are also not failing to see the tragedy. More than 150 lamas and nuns and commoners have immolated themselves a few years ago. Dalai Lama had to appeal to them. All the 4 sects gurus are in exile in India, including Karmapa. So, situation is not silent, situation is not dying, it is growing. And I'm very thankful to Professor Dibyesh Anand, and I'm very happy that Gandhian School for Democracy and Socialism has taken this opportunity to provide a bit of healing touch to the Tibetan tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, yes, Professor Dibyesh Anand.
I'll just give 2 minutes and then I can go. So
Yes,
thank
please.
you so much, Professor Anand, for this wonderful remark. We really need to meet in person when I'm next in India.
You are most welcome, sir. Most welcome. Come over. Come
Yeah,
over.
because we do need this kind of. Look, I've been working on 20-25 years with Tibetans. Of course, I found that with many Indians, I did not find this level of warmth / understanding. Right, that's the important part. And I'll just end by saying, because there was also questions, I'll answer it as part of closing my. Will China tolerate, etc., right? India's independence. Let me be very clear. China, any nation, in this case, of course, in China always came that it's very sensitive about. By the way, British media and British foreign office also believe the same, that, oh, you have to be sensitive on Tibet, Taiwan, Tiananmen, Uyghur, Xinjiang, human rights vis-a-vis China, sensitive, because Chinese get hurt. And I always wonder, how can a country of 1.3 or 1.4 billion get hurt by one small thing, anything? It is not. We know this is an imagination of the state. So I always say that there's a weaponization of sensitivity by China. So rather than thinking, will China be upset if India does X, Y, Z? Frankly, China is ready for war, ready for tensions, ready for various things. It will say it gets hurt, but it will not care. So even if India today throws out all Tibetans, which hopefully it will never do you think China will still trust India not to challenge it? It won't. So the question is, why compromise on human rights and on freedom and solidarity with people who are occupied for sake of sensitivity of a ruling system that does not represent anyone? So on that note, I'll end by saying again, thank you to the forum for inviting me, Randhir. I know it's last met. Thank you for inviting me. I hope we'll continue this conversation. And I'm so glad, I can't tell you how glad I am to see so many people from your part of the world, which is originally my part of the world, interest in this, which is rare. I can't tell you how rare that is. I'm so happy. So thank you so much for making my afternoon very happy.
And one question.
Oh, okay.
May I know the name of the picture of your side? You can see one poster there.
Oh, which one now?
Yes. Yes,
one?
this one. Yes, yes.
Well, that is from Kashmir, Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. So this is my Kashmiri mother, Parveena Angar. Her son was disappeared by the Indian state in 1991, still fighting for justice. That's what it is. I've got all these things from Kurdish, Kashmir, Tibet, and of course, one thing
Yes, I can see the whole world.
Yeah, but what I can, Baloch, by the way, Pashtun, all of this, I've got freedom. But there's one thing I can't show, but it's there. It's a cup that Dalai Lama used to drink water when he came to my university. I hosted him. By the way, I don't get visa for China. That's, you can imagine why. But anyway, that's it. And I don't care anymore. I hosted him. I kept the cup and khada because I wanted to take it to Tibet. Because I knew that not if I met someone, I would give it, they'll value it more than anyone else. and I haven't been able to go to Tibet since then. The reason I mention this is because I understand the costs attached to solidarity, but what is the point of solidarity and what is the point of humanity if we are not willing to take the cost? On that note, let me really end and rush to the episode of protest. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Good luck.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. And on behalf of GSDS Forum, we are very glad that today we had a very excellent deliberation. And it is a day that represents the courage, the determination, and the resilience of people who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to be forgotten, and who refused to give up their dream and freedom. So thank you so much. It was really enriching session, particularly both Anand, Professor Anand Kumar,
Thank you, my dear. Thank you.
Professor Dibyesh Anand and Anandagiri and Meera Chakti. Thank you so much. We look forward for your kind participation engagement in our coming dialogues. Thank you so much.